Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Money and Macro Talks. I'm Alejandro, and today we're joined by Sheri Berman. Sheri is a professor of political science at Columbia University and the author of several books and numerous articles exploring topics like European history and politics, the development of democracy, populism and fascism, and the history of the left. Today, we'll be focusing on the recent rise of populism in the West, its causes, its consequences, and what it tells us about contemporary politics. So, Sheri, it's a privilege to have you here. Welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
So let's start with a basic question. What is populism? And could you give us like a brief overview of its nature and its history?
Right. So that's actually a great place to start because this topic now has become so vast that there are sort of almost as many conceptualizations of what populism is as there are populist parties out there. So I would say that the sort of social science literature converges around a couple of key characteristics, sort of us versus them approach to politics, very strong anti-establishment stance, that is to say, a kind of rejection of existing parties and institutions, and a kind of, how shall we say, sort of a way of selling themselves, populist politicians and parties, of selling themselves to the electorate as the kind of true representatives of the people. So all of those things, I think most of the definitions, even when they layer on some other things, kind of focus on. I'd like to just say, though, that I think it is very, very important when we think about populist parties to think about whether or not we really want to conflate them with anti-democratic parties. And I say this because I think a lot of social scientists assume that there is something inherently anti-democratic about populism. And we may want to talk more about this, but that definition, for instance, does not necessarily imply anti-democratic behavior or anti-democratic intent. It might, but it might not. So to say, for instance, that existing institutions and parties are not doing a good job of representing the people or responding to their grievances, party that argues that existing institutions and parties are corrupt, that they have fallen out of touch with the people, that is not inherently anti-democratic. So I think it's very important when we think about populism as a phenomenon, and even when we think about the definition, not to conflate it with anti-democratic behavior or intentions. For that to be the case, something more than simply, again, this kind of anti-establishment position, this sense that other parties and institutions are somehow or another illegitimate or unresponsive, that in and of itself is not anti-democratic. It must be paired with other things for it to do so. But I'll stop there, and we could probably get into some of these issues a little bit later on.
Yeah, so what I got from your response is that it's not correct to understand populism as a particular ideology or as a particular anti-democratic sentiment. It's perhaps better understood as a rhetoric, as a style of communication that basically divides the political tension between, the corrupt elites and the innocent people. And you can feel this draft with different ideologies, right? So could you perhaps tell us a little bit about the difference between right-wing populism and left-wing populism?
So I think that's a good point, which is to say that most folks who look at populism don't associate populist parties or politicians with a very particular ideology. So in that sense, it's somewhat different from saying, okay, communists or fascists or even for that matter, liberals. And liberal these days also covers a sort of vast territory. And that is indicated by the fact, as you said, that there are populist parties on both the left and the right. And clearly these do not share any kind of coherent ideology. So yes, it is more of a way of, sort of drawing attention, I would say, if not to a rhetoric, although I think that's part of it, to a particular style of politics, to a way of approaching both the party or the politician's participation in the political system and their view of it. So to get back to the question that you asked in particular, populist parties on the left and the right? So what they share, as I mentioned before, are those sort of few characteristics, right? A sense that the establishment is corrupt, out of touch, unresponsive, unwilling or unable to respond to people's grievances, that, there is a strong divide between them the populist party and, sort of the rest of the political system, the established political order, and that they somehow represent, sort of the true will of the people. For the left, right, the enemy or the them tends to be defined usually, but not always, sort of economic terms, the billionaire class, the 1%, the sort of the wealthy, the capitalists, yada, yada, yada. That's very common on populist parties of the left. We see that in some parties in Europe. It's very popular, or it's the predominant form, rather, I should say, of populism in places like Latin America. For the right, again, in addition to the them being the establishment, the them is often also minorities, the sort of woke elite, the educated elite, out of touch elite, immigrants, that kind of thing. So on the right-wing version, the sort of the groups that are most, sort of mobilized against tend to be defined often in, racial, ethnic, or communal terms as opposed to economic ones. So this is very broadly, I would say, the difference, but there are that's broad, and each party has its own particular, sort of agenda and sort of rhetoric.
Yeah, so could you just give us like a brief overview of the history of this style of politics? When did it and where did it emerge? And what's the current state of populism right now?
So this term populism, although it's very popular today or very prevalent today, maybe is the better way of putting it, this is not a term that is, sort of that has been developed in the last 15 years. I mean, populism is a term that was used, for instance, in American politics, to describe movements in the late 19th and early 20th century. These were movements also, again, that share those characteristics, sort of they were motivated by grievances against the existing order. In particular, it came during a time of rapid economic change when rural folks, farmers, things like that were very much suffering from rapid changes in the economic order. And again, the sort of feeling was that the establishment parties, establishment institutions were not willing or able to respond to their needs. Sometimes that term is also used to apply to movements in the Russian context, again, sort of somewhat similar before the Russian Revolution. So this term has existed for a long time, but it's really come back into vogue to capture what is seen as an explosion of parties, particularly in the last 15 years in the advanced industrial West, Europe, the United States, other parts of, sort of the advanced industrial world, Australia, places like that, of these parties that are really mobilizing against the establishment and the established order and really mobilizing negative grievances. That is to say, the feeling on the part of many voters that the parties that have long existed, the sort of post-war traditional parties, simply are no longer willing or able to respond to their grievances and to the broader challenges their societies face.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's discuss why is this happening throughout the last decades. Why is this style of politics becoming increasingly appealing for many voters? Okay, I know there are many explanations, but since this is an economics channel, I would like I would like to have your account of what role economics plays into this sudden emergence of populist politics.
So let me say that again, if one was to sort of scan the literature out there by social scientists, more sort of generally political scientists, sociologists, economists, and others, I would say that the explanations for the rise of populism fall into three categories. And there's a tendency to sort of want to find a single answer or a single cause for this phenomenon. I think that is probably incorrect or misleading. However, that doesn't mean that we can't say that some causes are more important than others. So I'll start with the economic. I would say the two other main categories or types of causes would be social and cultural, and then what you might call those related to communications technology, the rise of social media, now potentially AI, that kind of thing. So the economic causes, I think, are the ones that are probably pretty intuitive, not just to your listeners, but to people more generally. We know, right? Everybody feels, even if one is not personally affected by it, that we have been going through a period of very, very dramatic and extremely disruptive economic change for the last couple of decades. And what does this mean? Specifically, it means that Western societies have become more unequal. That's not just questions of income and wealth inequality, but also very politically consequential growing inequalities between rural and urban areas or thriving metropolitan areas and those areas that have been left behind. And this is not something that has been going on forever. That is to say, there has always been within capitalist society some areas that are richer and some areas that are poorer, some areas that are the centers of innovation and others that are not. But the divergence between these regions really has grown in the last couple of decades. So we have really growing inequality, again, both at the income and wealth levels and also between areas within countries themselves. We also have, of course, growing automation and growing or rapid trade shocks, as economists refer to them, which means, again, that you have parts of countries that have really been, if not decimated, really very strongly affected by changes in the nature of capitalism that have really eliminated jobs, undermined community organizations, and really left a lot of people without much in the way of economic opportunities. So, really these things have dramatically affected citizens in Western countries. And the fact that they have had political consequences, I think, is not surprising. So for many scholars, and again, these kinds of explanations are particularly popular among economists, one looks at these kinds of economic causes and tries to figure out the ways in which they have influenced voters' political choices, and in particular, their choices to vote for parties that are, again, anti-establishment, opposed to the existing order, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah, so it seems that particular manufacturing regions that were hit very hard from openness to trade or even from automation, like regions in the US that ended up more likely to voting for Trump, or regions in the UK that ended up a little bit more likely to vote for Brexit or for the AfD in Germany. But to me, I have two issues with the economic story that I would like to share with you. So first, I think it's pretty obvious that this quote-unquote losers of the globalization are not the only voters of these parties. Some of them have voted for them, but there are also plenty of middle-class and high-skilled professionals that voted for Trump or voted for, Brexit. And on the other hand, it's not too clear for me why would these displaced workers, either from automation or from trade, would turn out to vote for right-wing political parties instead of left-wing populism. There's always been some people on the left channeling rage against, the super rich. Why weren't those guys who captured the votes from the unsatisfied losers of globalization?
So I think you raise a variety of good points. And let me say, I think this is why, sort of economic causes alone are not going to give us the answer. But let me sort of try to respond to some of your specific points. First of all, yes, right-wing populist parties, while they do disproportionately draw votes from, what you might call the economically left behind, that is to say, folks who have not thrived in the economy of the last few decades, they do not draw votes from those voters alone. So yes, that's a very important voting constituency for these parties, but clearly they're drawing other voters. So, that's an important thing to note also. The second thing to note, which is a point that, again, I brought up right at the beginning, was that these parties very much mobilize around social and cultural grievances, right? Which is to say that, if you look at the rhetoric of right-wing parties, the things that they emphasize are social and cultural issues, right? We don't like woke educated elites. We are very upset about immigration. We think, diversity has gone too far. So their own agenda is not primarily focused on economic issues, right? So we have to kind of understand those things. And I would say there's a couple of different ways of doing that. One is, and I think maybe, we can talk about that next, is there are very significant, in addition to economic changes, disruptive economic changes that have happened in Western societies over the last decades, these have been occurring at the same time as very disruptive social, demographic, and cultural changes, as well as changes in those communication technologies, right? So I would say, just to sort of step back for a second, that's really one of the things that's most distinctive about our era, right? Which is that we are really facing a number of challenges at the same time: economic change, social and cultural change, and changes in these technologies that really shape the way we communicate with each other, relate to each other, yada, yada, yada. So that's sort of very important to keep in mind. What a lot of scholars will say, right, who look at economic causes, right, is that, look, there's a kind of causal chain here, which is to say that these economic changes sort of create grievances within citizens, and that right-wing parties then mobilize them not on those economic grievances, but on those social and cultural ones. And will say things like, to get back to this question of rhetoric, look, the reason why your jobs are going away is because, immigrants have come in and taken jobs from you, lowered wages, are taking away public resources. In Europe, for example, where the public sector is much larger than in the United States, there's excellent research showing, for example, that if you put, native citizens in competition with immigrants and asylum seekers for resources like housing, you will absolutely get an almost immediate jump in rising in support for populist parties, right? So the causal chain starts with the economic causes, and it then moves on to analyze how those economic causes are filtered through competition with minorities and immigrants, the rhetoric of populist parties that seeks to shift blame to minorities and immigrants for these problems, and things like that. So, you can both kind of think about economic causes as kind of ultimate causes and some of these other things as kind of intermediate causes. That's one way to kind of reconcile, so to speak, the fact that economic disadvantage, let's say, does not correlate perfectly with populist voting, right? The idea is that this creates a kind of setting or a context within which it's much easier to mobilize people around grievances, and right-wing parties mobilize those people around grievances that are really more related to social and cultural than directly economic issues. The second point here, I would say, and I think this is very important, and it's something that I've worked a lot on, is so you said, look, if it is economic causes, why have right-wing populists been the prime beneficiaries as in most countries as opposed to left-wing ones? Well, one reason is, like I said, they mobilize those economic grievances by turning them into or interpreting them through the framework of social and cultural grievances. But the other thing to note is that, sort of traditional left-wing parties, the Democratic Party in the US, socialist, social democratic, labor parties in Europe, right? These parties underwent a very dramatic shift in profile in the late 20th and early 21st century, right? They moved very much to the quote unquote center on economic issues. They lost their distinctive economic profile. They became very much dominated by, the sort of educated elites who listen to podcasts or conversations like this one. And so when these economic changes really began to become politically consequential, they were no longer there as vehicles to mobilize the folks who were feeling sort of, if not directly left behind, threatened by these economic changes. That's a long-winded way of saying, look, you can reconcile these things in two ways. One is by looking at how successful right-wing parties have been in interpreting these economic grievances through a social and cultural lens. And then the second is that, your sort of traditional center-left parties kind of lost the ability to mobilize these people during the late 20th and early 21st century by very much dramatically changing both their economic policy profile and the way they presented themselves to the electorate. That is to say, more as parties of educated elites than parties of workers, the economically disadvantaged, yada, yada.
Yeah, but wouldn't you say then that, for example, the Nordic countries, which in comparative terms, they have more social policy, they have policies that directly benefit the more disadvantaged ones. They have a well-developed welfare system. They have generous safety nets. If this was a story about economic dislocation, then we should expect that countries that, help more these sort of dislocated people should be more immune to this style of rhetoric. But what we see is that, populist right-wing parties have also gained in Nordic countries.
Right. I mean, you're right. Interestingly, and maybe this is why you asked this question, I mean, that was sort of an original hypothesis of many social scientists, right? Which is that these societies with well-developed welfare states would be less susceptible to populism. And in fact, that has not been the case. But the sort of productive aspect of that is that by trying to figure out why that is the case, scholars have done some really great research on the dynamics in these societies. And for instance, one of the things that comes up over and over again, right, is that when you put people in competition with, let's say, immigrants for public resources, right, even in places, or perhaps particularly in places where citizens come to expect those resources, that you will, create a breeding ground for populism. So we can see this, for instance, again, sort of great natural experiments, so to speak, have been done in a variety of places where you can watch, right? For example, communities where large numbers of immigrants came, for instance, in that 2015, 2016 wave of immigration to Western Europe as a result primarily of the Syrian civil war. And you can see these immigrants come, right, and be given priority in things like access to public housing. Absolutely immediately, you see jumps in support for populist parties. This is especially, again, as I said, in places where citizens have come to expect public provision of a variety of goods, a very, very dangerous dynamic, right? Housing is a pretty obvious one, but you can see it in a whole variety of other things. Schools that people feel have become overloaded, healthcare services that are under strain and then are forced, quote unquote, to provide services for a whole range of new people. I mean, these are situations where you are pretty much asking for citizens to become sort of resentful, and again, to see these dynamics in us versus them kind of ways, right? Which is, look, our healthcare services are overburdened. We do not have enough housing. Our schools cannot deal with these kinds of challenges. And you get very clear rising support for populist parties and these kinds of things. And to get back to the previous question, then the issue is, look, is this really a question of economic grievances, right? Because it's not necessarily, racism or xenophobia, at least not directly, right? What it is a sense that, there's just a limited amount of resources to go around. And why should I be, I pay taxes, I live here. Why should I be giving up my health care or my access to housing or good schooling for my kids for these folks, that kind of thing. And so again, you sort of see how these kind of economic grievances and these, sort of quote unquote social and cultural ones can be very difficult to disentangle.
Yeah, it's a zero-sum mentality at the end of the day, right? So, for example, when I think about my parents' generation, they experienced really high economic mobility. Like, for them, it was really clear that they were going to live better than my grandparents. And for my generation, I feel that certainty no longer exists. Growth is slower. Cities, struggle to build enough houses for newcomers. So housing prices are soaring. And, many people, I think in this stagnation environment, you sort of develop this scarcity mindset, where you start seeing the world as a zero-sum game, like, where if group gains usually come at the expense of another group. So, this is like, and I think populist parties, they appeal to this framework at least better than traditional parties, right? Like finding scapegoats, and you can blame billionaires for, the housing crisis, bad public services. You can blame immigrants for the same reasons, but it has more this zero-sum taste to it, right?
I think that's a very important point, right? And I think this concept of zero-sum politics is a very important one. It's just very hard for democracy to work well in a kind of zero-sum context, in a context where one group of people feels like, for them to get something or to win, somebody else has to lose. I mean, one of the sort of most salient characteristics of the post-war period, right, was that the sort of growth of that era, the continual growth, really created a politics where you did not have to have this kind of zero-sum mentality, right, which is that, growth meant the pie was getting bigger, and so there was no problem sharing it more, so to speak, with workers did not necessarily mean that businessmen had to, sort of suffer, right? You could have higher taxes and you could have, increasing profits, right? When things are zero sum, right, in a sort of low growth kind of system, again, this gets back to this kind of intermingling, so to speak, of economic and social and cultural causes. Political system becomes a competition between parties on who is to blame, right? So should we blame immigrants for the fact that there's only a limited amount of public resources and, if you get it, I don't get it? Or should we blame the billionaire class for that, right? And so zero-sum politics is just generally not healthy politics. And it is definitely much easier to kind of mobilize people around this idea that, they're benefiting and I should be benefiting. It's an us versus them kind of system in a world where, again, the economy is really not growing sufficiently to provide social mobility for everyone, to provide a sense that the future is going to be better than the present, to provide a sense that, okay, look, I can afford to be a little bit more generous, whatever, with my taxes to help the less fortunate because I'm doing well and my community is doing well. So yes, I would say that kind of underneath all of this, right, is the idea that, we are living in a time when really both the government and the economy are not quite, sort of up to generating the kind of growth and development that would enable us to solve many problems for many different people at the same time. That's just not a great context for compromise, for toleration, for sort of generosity of spirit.
Yeah, so I think these are like two very complementary ways to understand the role that economics plays in this story, right? You have in the background a slow stagnation of the economy, that triggers this zero-sum mentality where, if the pie is not growing and somebody's eating, that means that I'm not getting my share, right? And on top of that, you have trade shocks that have really, really hit hard, particular communities, okay? But I wanted to ask to move this conversation to the cultural sphere, okay? And talk about what type of values do voters for the populist right have? And, perhaps talk about how culture has changed in the last decades.
So also a big topic and an important one. There's a lot to say here. Let me start off with a few key points. So let me start with one basic thing, right? Which is that, European societies in the last generation have undergone a demographic shift that is really unprecedented in their history, which is to say that we now have societies that, a generation or so ago were relatively homogenous, now have numbers of foreign-born citizens that exceed in some cases the United States, which has obviously long been a country of immigration. Let me say that the United States also, even as a country that has long had these, sort of really vast waves of immigration, now has more of those kinds of citizens than even in its heyday in the sort of early 20th century. So I want to say that demographic shift is real. And just like we recognize that rapid economic change can be very destabilizing and dislocating, I think it's important, even for those of us, who are educated elites who are comfortable with this kind of thing, to recognize that this kind of change is really very dramatic. And, not recognizing that for some people, that is destabilizing and disorienting. And that is not the same thing as saying that they are racist and xenophobic, right? This is just a very dramatic change. Again, in the space of, a few decades, really, societies that were very homogenous have now become, again, at least as diverse as the United States. I'll just throw out one data point. It was after college, I graduated and I ended up spending a year in Sweden. Now, admittedly, this was ancient history. This was the late 20th century. That was an incredibly homogenous society at that time. I'm white and, whatever. And I was very, and I was conscious of the fact that, I just was different. That is now a society that has more foreign-born citizens than the United States. And simply to not recognize that is a challenge is very politically naive. And also not to conflate that with racism and xenophobia. I think those kinds of destabilizing challenges, those kinds of rapid changes, we are very comfortable in understanding how politically consequential they are in the economic sphere. So I want to throw that out as a real challenge. The second thing is, as I said, that this has coincided with these dramatic economic changes. And so that has really created, as you sort of said before, a very dangerous context where it is very easy to create this kind of zero-sum mentality, this us versus them mentality, the sense that groups are in competition with each other for jobs, for public resources, for that kind of thing. So that's just very important, I think, as at a sort of basic level to kind of keep in mind. Then I'd like to throw out at least one other factor, which is that, if we look at what's actually been going on with citizens' values, it's very easy because we see the rise of these right-wing parties that often do have xenophobic and sometimes racist appeals to assume that the people who are voting for them also share those values. That is not in fact the case, right? And so if we look, for instance, at people who vote for right-wing populist parties, some of them are racists and xenophobes. There's no doubt about it. But the majority of them often are not. And in fact, if we look at attitudes, racial attitudes, attitudes towards immigrants in both the United States and Europe, they have gotten dramatically more favorable over the last 30 years. That is just a secular increase in, sort of acceptance of whatever you want to call it, sort of diversity, right? So it's just way too overly simplistic to kind of assume that what's going on here is we've had this sort of dramatic increase in racism and xenophobia. That's neither true across the board, nor is it even true of citizens who vote for these parties. Okay, so let me say that. The second thing is that, what's also important to note is that, again, as we talked about a little bit before, where the establishment parties were not very good, particularly those on the left, in sort of offering a clear economic alternative to citizens who were suffering from the economic dislocations of the past generations. At the same time, what happened was, again, largely as a consequence of the fact that these parties became increasingly dominated by people, again, like us or like who listen to conversations like this, educated elites, right? Which is that educated elites became dramatically more left-wing on these social and cultural issues over the past generation, right? So I said, look, if you look at the overall value shift in societies, right? Overall, Western societies have become less racist and xenophobic over the past, let's say, 30 years. But particularly over the last 15 years, what has happened is that educated elites have gotten much more left-wing. So they have moved way, 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 way faster in that kind of, non-racist, non-xenophobic direction than other citizens. And so what is the consequence of this? Well, politically, the consequence of this is that almost all establishment parties, particularly those on the center left, but also those on the center right, became much more liberal on questions about immigration and assimilation than they had been, again, 30 years ago. So what does this mean? This means, again, that at the same time as citizens were like, oh my goodness, look at what's going on here. Our societies are changing dramatically. We're in the midst of this economic stagnation where, I feel like I have to compete for jobs. I have to compete for public goods. And at the same time, traditional establishment parties are inviting in tons of immigrants, allowing huge asylum flows, telling me that if I worry about this or I'm concerned about this, I'm a racist or a xenophobe. I mean, again, this kind of context, it's very easy to understand why people, even those who are not racist and xenophobic, would vote for parties that were the only ones oftentimes, who were calling for dramatic declines in immigration, who were insisting that citizens who came to these countries had to assimilate, right? That there was a kind of culture that they needed to accept, that, sort of multiculturalism, whatever you want to call it, had its downsides. I mean, if you look back at what was going on, 15 or 20 years ago, it's really quite dramatic how far center left and center right parties had moved, so to speak, to the left on these social and cultural issues, really leaving behind, so to speak, your sort of median citizen. So there was a huge, what social scientists often refer to as a representation gap between what citizens wanted with regards to, let's say, immigration policy in Western Europe and what mainstream parties were offering them. And in that kind of situation, the appeal of a party, even one that couched those policies often in xenophobic terms, is really not that difficult to understand.
Yeah, so in some way, society didn't change that much. Elites did. I mean, let's try to unpack this, right? Because I often hear some fears like, oh my God, like society is becoming super racist these days, which I think I don't buy that. I think when you look at opinion surveys, you see that opinions towards immigration have been relatively stable in the Western world. In fact, they've even come a little bit more favorable, as you were saying. And what is your theory of these representation gaps?
You sort of have answered the question yourself, right? Which is that if we look at what's happened over the last couple of decades, it's educated elites who have moved the most as far as their social and cultural values are concerned, right? So it's not that your average citizen has gotten more racist and xenophobic. In fact, just the opposite. What has happened is that educated elites have undergone in the last 15 plus years a dramatic shift to the left on these issues. And so this has really manifested itself in many ways, but one concrete way that's relevant to this is it managed to dramatically shift the policies that establishment parties had towards these kinds of issues, particularly around that time of that huge influx of asylum seekers and immigrants in 2015-16. This was a sort of deadly combination, deadly in the sense of what its political consequences were, that is to say, in creating an opportunity for right-wing populists in particular to mobilize around this issue. We can talk about, what's been going on at educational institutions or more generally among, sort of educated elites, but that is the key thing to focus on, right? I think the people, again, journalists and academics want to look at this and say, okay, what's happened here is that average citizens have become more racist and xenophobic. No, the change is not in them. The change is in us. And that has had a whole variety of political consequences. If we go back to this question of sort of what your median voter wants, right? Even those who are voting for right-wing populist parties, right? If you offered them kind of limits on, in particular, illegal immigration, which really drives people absolutely bonkers for reasons that I don't think should be that hard to understand, and a sort of insistence on some level of assimilation, right? That is really actually, I would say, in most countries, kind of the median position, which is we want limits, particularly we want an end to illegal immigration, and we want an insistence on assimilation. Now, again, assimilation is a pretty vague term, but, whatever. It has to be, it's not enough to say live and let live, right? That's just not, for most people, not acceptable, right? They have a sort of vague sense that some level of kind of social solidarity or coherence is necessary, and that, sort of parallel societies and dramatically different, sort of understandings of what is and is not acceptable. I'm not really sure how to put this, that is not something that they are, that they think is kind of good for their society's future. That's really, I would say, again, the kind of median position. And what's kind of odd, again, is how difficult it was for establishment parties, center-left parties in particular, but not only center-left, even many center-right parties, to kind of clearly articulate that, which is to say, okay, look, we have taken in a lot of people, but we can't do any more. And in particular, we're going to take a hard line on illegal immigration, that is to say, on people who are coming here without legitimate reasons or without, sort of through the legitimate processes. And we are also, again, going to insist on a level of assimilation that goes beyond simply, sort of whatever, passing, some kind of particular test. I think that really should not have been a difficult position to articulate, but it was 15 years ago. And that really, again, I think created a situation where right-wing populists could kind of scoop up all of this dissatisfaction, some of which, again, there are voters out there who are racist and xenophobic, but a lot of their voters were not. They were just very frustrated with not being offered any other alternative by mainstream parties, particularly those, but not exclusively those on the center left.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not because from a public policy perspective, governing irregular immigration is not that easy. And from a public policy perspective, it's very difficult to have like a clear-cut understanding of when exactly does a person become assimilated. I think what many people felt is that their concerns were not being taken seriously. Elites wouldn't be super understanding of people who have different moral values. They're just not as moral universalists as them. They prioritize control, they prioritize their fellow citizens, and when they perceive that the immigration system is not in the national interest, it's just some humanitarian action, they understandably become upset. But I also wanted to ask you about gender, because it's another dimension that is very contentious. And, as we were talking, are becoming more liberal. How is your understanding about gender equality? How do you feel there is a representation gap in several aspects regarding sex and gender?
So I would say I don't see that being as much of an issue as the sort of immigration issue, although it's part of it, right? I mean, in the United States is somewhat different than Western Europe. So sort of here, this kind of whole panoply of issues that has been subsumed under the, sort of umbrella of sort of wokeism is, sort of extremely resonant politically for, both because the Democrats moved far to the left on it and the Republicans and Trump in particular sort of harps on it. So some of these sort of, questions about traditional values have been thrown into the mix, I would say, again, even more in the United States than in Western Europe. And that has a lot to do with the fact that the United States is a more religious society. Religious voters are a stronger constituency than they are in Western Europe. But sort of these sort of social and cultural issues have become kind of wrapped up with some of the other things. The representation gap in Europe is very, very pronounced on this immigration issue. It's also pronounced in the United States for sure, because the Biden administration really did a very bad job, to get back to your question, your sort of point before, of kind of, whatever, during the border, the southern border. And so we had really huge numbers of immigrants coming in, and that, sort of got tied up with some other social and cultural issues. But, representation gaps are very dangerous because when they exist, and they exist on issues that become increasingly salient, right? So you can have a representation gap on an issue that's not particularly important or that voters aren't focused on, and you can kind of, paper over that. But when you have a representation gap on issues that are becoming increasingly salient, then again, you sort of have a real problem. And so particularly in the United States, I would say that these questions about immigration got tied up with other questions about gender ideology. Really, transgenderism is the kind of big issue, right? Which is that even though it's often conflated, there's simply no doubt in the United States, for example, attitudes towards gays and lesbians have gotten dramatically more liberal over the past several decades. Although what's happened is, because of the increasing salience of this transgender issue, there has been, sort of some shift. And that is, I think, extremely unfortunate. But, that is where, sort of Republicans really try to whip up resentments and fears.
Yeah, I think this is a very crucial point for our discussion here, the salience part of it, right? Because you can have representation gaps as long as they're not on the top of the political agenda of your voters, right? But for example, in episodes of small boats crossings or illegal border crossings, we usually find that immigration suddenly jumps, to the top of the political agenda in terms of what citizens are concerned about. I wanted to ask you about the media role here, because I think this is a very interesting place to talk about social media and what types of content it amplifies. For example, images of immigrant crimes, they circulate widely through social media, and they can, increase this salience of the issue. And so it does, increase the salience of what is a very small number of, transgender kids or whatever. Yeah. So how do you think about social media and its interaction with this style of politics?
So I think that's, sort of the third sort of set of causes that social scientists have focused on: economic, social and cultural, and then sort of social media. And here too, there's sort of a lot of things going on. So just to kind of link it up a little bit with our previous conversation, one thing that's very important to note is that the kind of people who are online, who are whatever, posting constantly on Twitter and Blue Sky and stuff like that, those are also a very unrepresentative sample of citizens, right? So the people who are on these platforms are really, again, the most extreme people on both ends, right? On both the left and the right. So there's a disproportionate number of people who are on these platforms who are pushing these conversations, who really do not have views, preferences, priorities that are overlapping with those of your average voter. So I think that's very important to note, right? Which is that a lot of the conversation is being pushed by people, again, who are not representative of your average voter. Now, that doesn't mean that it doesn't matter, right? Because that conversation is being pushed by those people, right? Those are the people who are the loudest. Those are the people whose voices get amplified. Those are the people whose voices get repeated or reported on in other kinds of settings. And so that is really very, very important. It also, so there's that, right? Which is that I think social media in general just sort of amplifies the extreme in a way that is very problematic for democracy and that overlaps with or interacts with in very dangerous ways with some of the other trends that we have been talking about. I mean, the other thing that a lot of folks focus on with social media is, how easy it is today, or how much easier it is today to sort of embed yourself in a community, an information community that simply reinforces your own existing, again, preferences and priorities, right? So you're not old enough, but maybe some of your listeners are old enough. I'm old enough to kind of remember a time, much less democratic in some ways, much less diverse time when people read, a certain limited number of papers. They watched the evening news. And again, there were downsides to that, right? It meant a lot of voices weren't heard, a lot of issues weren't fully reported on. But it meant that we were all kind of more or less subject to somewhat similar information flows, right? That is just not the case anymore. I mean, I have friends, highly educated friends, people with PhDs who really are living in a very particular left-wing world where they don't have any idea the kinds of things that are being debated on the right. And that's just because they don't need to, right? They can completely embed themselves in sources of information that are comfortable for them. And that is really very, very problematic. In the United States, somewhat true in Europe, but more in the United States, this has also really dramatically been accelerated by the decline of local newspapers and local news stations, which means that, again, you're not even getting that cross-cutting sense of, okay, look, here are the issues of my particular community. Everything has become kind of nationalized. And, so again, this is very bad. So social media amplifies extremism, facilitates an ability to not hear the other side. And of course, also, associate with both of these things, right? Just the spread of, again, misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories, right? Just spread now with incredible ease in a way that, of course, there were these things before, right? Like, these things have not been invented in the last 20 years, but just much easier to spread, much more rapid, and really, again, sort of very difficult to kind of counteract.
So let's put all the explanations together that now that we are approaching the 1 hour mark, okay? So first we were talking about economics. We've discussed that, yes, some economic dislocation happened. Some communities were hit harder than others. Particular groups of education were hit harder than others. And we see some of these, losers of globalization turn into the populists, right? But we also talk about that economics is not, it cannot provide a complete story unless you also understand, how elites move really to the left on several key issues also regarding immigration, okay? We also established that society as a whole is not becoming more anti-establishment, is not becoming more racist. These types of attitudes have remained stable. You always had people who were slightly more skeptical and prone to conspiracy theories. You always had people who were more skeptical towards immigrants. But sort of these kind of shares have remained stable, So what has happened to explain really, the rise of these populist parties then?
So, I mean, look, I would say that the most notable thing about our era is the concatenation of these three things, right? Which is to say that we are really facing and have been facing for the last 15 plus years a series of challenges, any one of which would have been quite significant for the quote unquote establishment or democracy more generally to deal with, right? Very destabilizing economic changes, very dramatic demographic changes, and with an associated social and cultural changes with that, and then very dramatic changes in communication technology. So it just to step back for a second, when I think about the last great period of disruption in Western history, right, which would have been the 1960s, right? Dramatic popular uprisings. I mean, and in fact, in Europe in particular, really very significant terrorism, right? Really very disruptive and destructive groups on the left, a little bit also on the right, of people who were engaged in terrorism, of violence, who wanted to overthrow the entire system, right? But what was noticeable about the 60s, right, is that was the challenge, right? You had really very dramatic social and cultural changes, very dramatic opposition to the existing system, but it was focused on, again, a sort of that particular set of issues, right? That was a time still of economic growth and economic optimism, right? Those challenges get sort of dealt with enough to kind of diminish those social and cultural uprisings. And then we get economic challenges again in the West in the 70s, economic stagflation, oil crisis. Maybe we're facing another one of those again, right? And that comes later in the 70s and 80s, right? But these challenges they did not overlap with each other the way they are doing today. And that just creates really a very, very difficult situation for the parties, the establishment parties, and for democratic systems. I think, we have to really recognize that the situation that we're in today, some people have referred to it as a polycrisis. I don't know, that's a kind of awkward term, but maybe it's helpful in kind of thinking about, what the nature of the contemporary age is. And these things interact with each other. It's much easier to understand a phenomenon, populism, if we can identify a single cause. It's economics, it's immigration, it's social media. I think that that's understandable, right? We want to understand what's going on, and we're looking for a kind of pretty simple and straightforward explanation. I think, unfortunately, that when we do that today, we're going to be missing a lot of what's going on. I think we really have to understand populism, right, as a series of politicians, parties, right, who are mobilizing around a sense that the existing institutions, the existing parties are not able, again, as we talked about right at the beginning, to deal with the challenges that our societies face. And I think that that is in fact true. And I think part of the reason for that is that these challenges simply are genuinely multifaceted and vast. And I think that if we want to really understand populism, we must recognize that we are truly living through difficult times, when we have economic challenges, when we have social and cultural challenges, when we have challenges in our, again, communications and media landscape, and that if we really as a society want strength in democracy, and by doing so, therefore, fight back against populism, we need to recognize all of these challenges head on. We need to recognize that dealing with them means not politics as usual, but really being willing to both conceptualize and figure out how to push through much more dramatic policy shifts than we needed in, the late 90s, when in retrospect, the challenges that we faced were really quite moderate in comparison to the challenges we face today.
So final question, should we worry? What is your prediction? Will we be able to, understand these challenges and address them properly? And what are the stakes of failing at this?
I think we should worry. And I'm based in the United States, so I am particularly worried. And I think that the situation facing democracy as a system in the United States is much more dire than any place in Western Europe. Eastern Europe is a different situation. But the situation here is extremely dire. Our democracy is in serious trouble, and we are we are living now as Americans in a society that is so polarized and divided that it is really very, for anyone who pays any attention to politics, just extraordinarily depressing and frustrating. I wish this not on anybody in Western Europe. And I would also say that the United States, for better or for worse, remains such a powerful country that what happens here has both direct and indirect effects, as we can unfortunately see in the current climate, on what happens in Western Europe. I mean, we are blowing up not only our own country, but an entire international system that, while extraordinarily flawed and sort of lacking in some important characteristics, is infinitely better than the chaos and uncertainty that we are dealing with now. And so what happens in the United States will also influence how successful European countries can be in strengthening their own democracies and healing the divisions within their own society. So I am extraordinarily worried. I'm not hopeless, but I am worried. But I think that the prerequisite for moving forward is, first, recognizing the multifaceted and serious nature of these challenges, and B, figuring out ways to address them that goes beyond politics as usual, because that is simply not going to be up to dealing with these challenges.
Sheri Berman, it's been an amazing conversation. And again, thanks for joining Monian Macro.
My pleasure.